I believe this is the right decision, a wise decision, and the best decision for America. Thank you. Thank you, and may God bless you all, and may God protect our troops.
Well, may God protect the ordinary, innocent people of Afghanistan too, actually. I played that. It was about 6 or 7 minutes long, Martin, because it actually was quite a good speech, really. You know, if you're going to do something which is humiliating, I mean, I suppose there would have been a lot of time and effort put into preparing a speech for Biden, which is every bit as humiliating as the end of the Vietnam War.
Well, in some respects, more humiliating.
Why?
Why? Because there's more at stake. I mean, the Vietnam War, the Vietnam War was more painful because it's the first time that they lost anything. Now they've actually got this is just a reprise in some senses. Well, the speech, I mean, the basic point he's making that we can't go on fighting in Afghanistan is pretty clear. It's obvious. But the Trump administration had negotiated with the Taliban. And they'd negotiated they were going to withdraw in May.
What I'm saying is Trump said no more wars, and he actually seems to be, Biden actually seems to be doing it. I mean, he really does. He's saying, look, we're just not having any more.
Well, one of the problems that both Biden...
And he's putting his money where his mouth is.
Biden and Trump may be saying no more wars, and that may be what the American people want to hear, but that's not what the Pentagon wants to hear. And I suspect that the precipitate withdrawal from Bagram and possibly the bomb attack at Kabul are part of the Pentagon sabotaging. So Biden will not get any... If Biden was able to withdraw from Afghanistan without a major issue, Afghanistan stabilises and becomes a relatively prosperous place, then the Pentagon will be furious. Afghanistan now, what they did with the Vietnamese after the loss of the Vietnam War is they had sanctions on Vietnam for 20 years. Nobody's allowed any aid or trade or anything. So far from paying compensation to the Vietnamese for smashing the place up, they actually spend 20 years trying to ruin them, and that's probably what's going to happen.
And also using that as a way to negotiate with any new government, saying,
yes,
"Look, we will only drop the sanctions if you do as we say."
Basically, yes. So I mean, when he says the war is over, the war may not be over in Afghanistan. The problem in Afghanistan is that the war just keeps mutating into a different war and another war with a different set of people.
It's great that you say that, Martin, because that's exactly what Scott Ritter is about to talk about, and saying that, well, it starts off with one mission, the mission changes and changes and changes. It transmogrifies into whatever suits the Pentagon once the first excuse. This is very 1984, isn't it? The idea is we're supposed to forget why we were first there. Of course, Afghanistan was supposed to be all about Osama bin Laden hiding in a cave and carrying out 9/11.
Indeed. And even if it was the case that bin Laden did it, and of course bin Laden himself said he didn't do it, the Taliban had said, well, if you give us the evidence and we'll hand him over. But they said, no, we need to invade. And that's because they wanted to invade. Because the real reason for invasion is not because they want anything that's in Afghanistan. It's because they want to stop the Russians, the Chinese, the Pakistanis having what's in Afghanistan. Yeah? So in other words, if you can't win the war on the ground, and of course the war has been won by the contractors, and all that money is talking about $300 million a day. Most of that money went back into the pockets of contractors in the US.
In July,
none of it was spent in Afghanistan, or a tiny fraction of it.
In July 2001, Bill Cooper, on his radio show in the United States, said bin Laden, they're going to be blaming something on him. This was after there was a CNN interview with bin Laden in a cave in Afghanistan for the US population, saying, well, CNN have tracked him down, the CIA couldn't find him. So obviously the CIA were running him. And Bill, with his naval intelligence background, said, well, this guy is about to be set up for something, some sort of big attack on the United States is going to be blamed on him. But at the end of the day, I mean, I did a thing in 2011 when they had this Abbottabad where they supposedly killed bin Laden. Martin, I think there's quite a lot of evidence that he died around the time of the 9/11 attacks, actually, because he had a kidney complaint.
That's right. And at the time, it was reported in The Guardian that in November, was it November? Yes. That he was still in contact with his CIA handlers, according to French sources.
So this is after 9/11, you're saying, or not?
I can't remember the timeline.
Sure when.
I can't remember the timeline, and I'd need to look it up. I mean, but
he did have a serious kidney illness.
Oh, he did.
He?
Yes,
back in 2001.
That's right. Yes,
but he was supposed to have lasted another 10 years. A lot of people believe that he died actually way back.
Yes.
Just after the turn of the century.
The Abbottabad incident, as I call it. If you talk to anybody from Pakistan or people who drive taxis or run shops around in Bristol, nobody believes a word of that. Nobody believes a word of that at all.
If I remember rightly, you had a chat with Jon Snow from Channel 4 News, a face-to-face chat about this. So just a quick little.
This was. I think it was before the invasion of Afghanistan, because I'd seen in the Guardian that, not that long ago, there had been this was according to the French secret services. That there had been a meeting in Doha, I think it was, where bin Laden was in hospital, and the CIA had turned up with a get well card and some flowers for him.
Exploding flowers?
Well, no. I don't know. But anyway, I because it had been reported on Channel 4 News, I then saw Jon Snow at the cinema, and I went up to him and buttonholed him. I wouldn't.
This is in central London.
This is in Notting Hill. You wouldn't normally do that. If people are on a night out, you don't want to just buttonhole them. But I thought I'm going to buttonhole him about this because I'm interested. Said you reported that there had been a meeting between the CIA and bin Laden, not that long ago, in a hospital in Doha.
I think it was Dubai. Actually.
Dubai,
anyway,
that's right.
The American hospital in Dubai. Yeah.
Yes, and the source was the French secret services, and he said yes, but we only ran the story because we checked it with the British doctor who'd actually carried out the operation. So that's what he told me.
So at that point, bin Laden was, a life-threatening injury. Although I suppose you can carry on with one.
But more important to the point is that he was still very much in cahoots with the CIA, literally weeks before the so-called 9/11 attack. Or his involvement in the 9/11 attack.
Okay, so what about this Saudi connection? Because although of course bin Laden was over in Afghanistan, he wasn't an Afghan; he was a Saudi, and the hijackers on 9/11, supposed hijackers, were also Saudis.
Well, that's right, and of course, ultimately, I mean, leaving aside all these ins and outs, the basic contours of what's going on is clear. The Saudi Mukhabarat works with Western intelligence service to set up Al Qaeda
and the Mossad, by the way,
to fight the Russians in Afghanistan, the Soviets in Afghanistan. Everybody accepts that. There's no dispute about it. And the story is that this whole international brigade of Islamist terrorists, which we armed and trained, they were trained by our special forces with your taxes, British people listening to this show, they suddenly turned on us and decided that they were going to attack us. And then we've got to go to war to invade Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, all the rest of it. Now,
7 countries in 5 years.
Yeah, but the very least you could say about that is, are we going to hear sorry from any of you about arming and training these people in the first place? As Madeleine Albright said, well, what's more important, a few stirred-up Muslims or the destruction of the Soviet Union? Come on. And, of course, even if everything they say was true, that would still be a big question to ask. Was it worth setting up Al-Qaeda in order to destroy the Soviet Union? Because they freely admit that they did set it up. I mean, as Robin Cook, when he, God rest him, said when he was Foreign Secretary, everybody knows that the word Al-Qaeda means the base, and it means the database that was held in Jordan by the Western powers of all the people that had been trained and sent to Afghanistan. That's what it was. Well, that's where the word Al-Qaeda comes from.
This Charlie Wilson's war business, it all started, didn't it? Operation Cyclone in Afghanistan, and it's taken on a life of its own to places like Yugoslavia, where you were, and obviously much more recently in places like Libya and Syria.
Yes, well, the point is that you could argue that this is an unintended effect of their meddling and their stupidity. Now, even that should mean that they should hang their heads in shame and many of them should go to prison. But it's worse than that. As anybody who's been following things in Syria over the last decade will know, we are still working with Al-Qaeda. It's not as if we've suddenly decided we're against them and we're now going to hunt them down, even though we trained them in the first place. In Syria, they're still being trained and directed by British military personnel.
And also the funding. Let's look at the funding for a moment, because Scott Bennett, the former psychological warfare officer in the US, has absolutely blown the whistle on that, going through Swiss banks like UBS to get money to these people that we're supposed to be fighting every day on the national news bulletins.
Well, that's right. I mean, there are various levels of this where you could just, even if we accept their version of events, they are attempting to evade responsibility for what they've done. But of course, it's worse than that. And of course, it's not just us here on People's Republic of Southcroft talking about these things. We're going to hear from Scott RItter, former US Marine Colonel, in a minute. But of course, you can imagine that the Russian Marine Colonels, Chinese Marine Colonels, and Iranian Marine Colonels know what we know and a hell of a lot more.
They don't seem to make so much of a big fuss about this in order to sort of almost con the criminals here in the West into thinking that they don't know about it. It's quite clever, actually.
Well, if you think about it, that's if you knew what was going on, you don't necessarily go, oh God, that's terrible. You just make sure you know what's going on, and then you make your plans accordingly, don't you?
And hopefully the people that have been doing these things, the deep state NATO intelligence services, will be wrong-footed by thinking that you don't know stuff you do know. Anyway, someone that does know what's going on, he picks up the story of Osama bin Laden, the 9/11 attacks 20 years ago in Afghanistan, looking at exactly who they were tracking down, bin Laden, in this cave in Afghanistan, and why they were there in the first place.
Let's start off by, again, using what I talked about in the arms control world, how a problem is framed. Understand that problems can be reframed as they progress, that you can start with the intention of doing something, and then later on, as the situation develops, you'll reframe your objectives. And that's what happened in Afghanistan. It was just a continuous reframing of objectives. We started actually with a very pure operation, wrong-headed, I believe, but pure, meaning that the United States was attacked by terrorists on 9/11. Thousands of Americans and people of other nationalities were killed on that date. And the president determined that we would seek revenge against those who perpetrated the attack. It was determined that Al-Qaeda, an organization, the base, headed by a gentleman named Osama bin Laden, was responsible. And we decided that we were going to go into Afghanistan, where Osama bin Laden resided, together with the bulk of his Al-Qaeda organization, and we were going to annihilate him.
Well, hang on, that doesn't make any sense, because he's a Saudi, and almost all the hijackers were Saudis.
But he lived in Afghanistan. We're not going after Saudis. We were going after Osama bin Laden, and we were going after the Al-Qaeda organization, which was based out of, at least the main party of it was based out of Afghanistan. So that's why we went there. And again, they were there as guests of this organization called the Taliban, which at the time was the government of Afghanistan, although at the time only a few nations recognized it as such. Most nations recognized it as this mob of Islamic fundamentalists who had been engaged in a civil war with other elements in Afghanistan, and whose ruling methodology was deemed to be medieval in nature, especially when it came to women. And the Taliban, being based out of Kandahar originally, which is in southern Afghanistan, is primarily a Pashto organization, meaning they're from the Pashto tribes. And they had invited bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda members to Afghanistan after bin Laden had been chased out of other nations, Saudi Arabia, Sudan. They brought him in under what's called Pashtunwali, which is a very complex tribal code that basically says, when we bring you in and bring you under our protection, we guarantee your protection. But there's a two-sided street to that, meaning that while you're under our protection, you cannot violate the rules, the norms, the standards of the Pashtun tribes and of Islamic law. And when 9/11 occurred, the Taliban actually did reach out and talk with the United States through intermediaries and others and say, hey, if bin Laden and al-Qaeda did what you say he did, he's violated Pashtunwali. And this is unacceptable. And while we won't turn him over to you, we will turn him over to a third party for Islamic justice, and we will evict al-Qaeda from Afghanistan if you just show us the proof that he was involved. But, at that point in time, we were in the business of stacking bodies. It wasn't about getting a just outcome. It was about getting an outcome that made Americans feel good. And in order to do that, we had to kill people. We had to kill a lot of people. And no better way to kill a lot of people than expand our war in Afghanistan to include not just bin Laden and al-Qaeda, but now all of the Taliban. So our war transformed. It went from simply hunting down al-Qaeda to now destroying the Taliban and removing them from power. And when you opt to remove a government from power, you create a vacuum that you are now obligated to fill. And in doing so, you've now incurred a nation-building requirement, a nation-building task. And that's what happened. That's how we went from simply trying to kill Osama bin Laden to being neck deep in a nation-building exercise in Afghanistan. It didn't start out that way, but that's the way it ended up.
Yeah, but hang on a minute. The Taliban are potentially your allies, helping you round up the mastermind of 9/11, and you decide you're going to, instead of working with them to get hold of him, you're going to attack them, the one organization in the world that can actually help you to get hold of the perpetrator of 9/11.
Look, this is, in a nutshell, you just described the debate I had with Richard Holbrooke, who later on became the czar, so to speak, of Afghan-Pakistan relations under Obama. But I basically, in a debate I had with him on the History Channel in October of 2001, I said, look, the best policy we can have here is avoid putting American boots on the ground, and instead work with the Taliban to isolate al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, and get them removed. This also means we need to work with Afghanistan's neighbors, the Pakistanis, the Iranians, the various former Soviet republics, to work with us so that when they receive bin Laden, we can be assured that he will be treated in a manner which prevents him ever again threatening the United States. This will require us to work with moderate elements within the Taliban. And Holbrooke laughed and said, there are no moderate Taliban. Well, he didn't know what he was talking about. There were moderate Taliban at the time. A guy named Mutawakil was the foreign minister. He was moderate. He was surrounded by others who were moderate. And even Mullah Omar, who was the leader, is the one who said, if you violate Pashtunwali, you will pay a price. But no, the problem was, see, what I'm laying out here to you about respecting Pashtun tribal culture, respecting Pashtunwali, and respecting people to adhere to a code that has defined their life requires a level of understanding of the cultural norms and history of that region that the average American politician lacks. And the average American is ill-equipped to embrace readily. After 9/11, the American people weren't prepared to sit down and be lectured to by people like me about how the best way forward to avoid a quagmire would be to negotiate with the Taliban, to work with the Taliban, to neutralize bin Laden in a manner that reduced collateral damage, reduced potential harm to Americans, reduced potential harm to innocent Afghan civilians. That would require a lot of explaining. And one thing I learned in the military early on, when I was standing in front of a general explaining that what I did was actually right, he shut me up. He said, Lieutenant, when you're explaining, you're losing. And the fact that you're standing here before me today explaining something means you lost. Get out of my office. This is true for American politicians. The moment they start explaining something to their constituency, they've lost. They can't get involved in complex discussions with their constituents, especially after such an event as 9/11, where what people wanted was revenge. Bloodlust was up. It was easier to tell the American people, we're going in, we're going to wade into Afghanistan, and we're going to slaughter bin Laden, we're going to slaughter al-Qaeda, we're going to slaughter the Taliban, and the American people would thump their chests, give 3 or 4 ooh-ahs, and say, this is great, as opposed to saying, hey, I know you guys want blood, but this is what we're going to do. We're going to actually hold back on the troops, and we're going to engage in this process that might take a couple months to explain to bin Laden, or explain to Mullah Omar and the Taliban why bin Laden's a bad guy. And then bin Laden will be transferred to a third party, and then it's going to probably take us a couple more months to get an outcome that is satisfactory to us. You'd be cut off at the knees the second you started having that conversation with the American people in the 2001, the post 9/11, 2001, 2002 timeframe. It was much easier just to say, no, we're sending the boys in, we're stacking bodies, because that's something the American people understood, and that's something they were prepared to undertake.
Yeah, but you see, sometimes in situations like September the 11th attacks, the response might be far worse than the attacks themselves, and actually send the nation or the world on a collision course and actually into a disastrous area, particularly when, deciding, right, we're just going to tear up the rule book of the UN and start doing regime changes here, there and everywhere. And also, of course, there is the fact that we know now there are some quite serious questions about 9/11 as to whether bin Laden from his cave in Afghanistan was really the mastermind. Now we know about the collapse of Building 7, which wasn't hit by a plane. We also know about the complete non-appearance, it seems, of the United States Air Force in intercepting those jets, and the collapse of the, supposedly the best prepared and most powerful air defense in the world, Scott.
Well, I'm not going to get into 9/11. What I will say is that if you wanted to take out the masterminds of 9/11, the place to bomb would have been Hamburg, Germany, because that's where 9/11 was planned, according to the narrative that the U.S. government itself promotes. So, going into Afghanistan was absurd. And I think one of the big lessons of this whole 20-year fiasco is if we don't get it right at the start, the end result can be far worse than the event that initiated it. And I think that when we take a look at the totality of our 20-year debacle in Afghanistan, that harmed America and the world far more than the events of 9/11 did.
Now, I know you say you don't want to get into that, but I think you need to just explain, just a couple of paragraphs, what you mean by Germany, because certainly, I've heard all sorts of things about the 9/11 attacks, most of them to do with them being organized from Afghanistan, not Germany.
Well, I mean, that is a narrative. The organized from Afghanistan is a narrative that's promoted by the debriefings of people like Sheikh Mohammed and others who have been captured and tortured and imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay. But when we trace the 19 hijackers, they operated out of Hamburg, Germany. They operated out of a mosque. The money was brought together there, and the 19 hijackers were shipped from there around to the various locations. I'm grossly oversimplifying this, but to me, the notion that 9/11 was planned, in a cave somewhere in Afghanistan is ludicrous. We know that bin Laden was aware of 9/11. I think there's some evidence that he talked about something happening, but the notion that he planned it, that he sat there and said, no, we're going to specifically train you guys to do X to accomplish Y. No, I think at least the narrative that is promulgated by the United States supports, Hamburg as being the planning center for 9/11.
Well, that is definitely worth thinking about. The next time we see some sort of mass terror attack, a bit like the September 11th or anything like that, God forbid, happening again, we should be extremely wary about what we're being told at the time is the cause and who has done it and where it's been done from, because it seems to me quite often we hear afterwards quite a lot more information than we're getting at the time. And I'm also a little bit suspicious when, all the dots are joined within the first 24 hours, Scott.
Well, look, first of all, absolutely. When you claim to have absolute certainty of knowledge about, one of them, about an event that has yet to be totally comprehended, you need to be suspicious. I always operate under the notion that you can't solve a problem until you first properly define it. And what happened with our desire for revenge in Afghanistan is that we came up with a solution without first understanding exactly what occurred. I mean, it seems to me that we should have allowed a 9/11 type commission to reach a more defined understanding of what exactly happened before we started talking about taking the nation to war. But no, we rushed to judgment. And again, it's because, what happened after 9/11 was very political, very political. I mean, we only have to listen to, people who talk about Paul Wolfowitz sitting down with the president on September 12th, talking about exploiting the events of 9/11 to carry out regime change in Iraq. There were no Iraqis on board any of those aircraft. Iraq had nothing to do with this. Iraq was a sworn enemy of Al-Qaeda. And yet, here we have senior government officials talking about using 9/11 as an excuse to initiate a war of regime change with Iraq. So yes, you're right. We need to be extraordinarily skeptical, and we have a duty and responsibility as citizens to demand answers from our government before they take us down a path of, in the case of Afghanistan, a 20-year disaster.
Okay, so what was Afghanistan really about, and why, as NATO, the US leading the Brits, etc., out? Why now?
Well, I mean, 9/11. If again, we trace it back in the immediate aftermath. The United States put a tremendous amount of pressure on NATO to execute Article 5, to say since the United States has been attacked, NATO is now going to come to our collective self-defense. And NATO, like the compliant puppy dog that they are, they did this, and it's the only time that Article 5 has been implemented. And NATO aircraft came to the United States. They had AWACS aircraft flying over, like we really needed a NATO AWACS airplane here. And they did some other things in terms of putting up boats in the Mediterranean. They had naval patrols to keep terrorists out coming from North Africa, etc. That was all under Article 5. And then we went to the United Nations, and again, we used the pain and suffering of those people who died on 9/11 to twist the United Nations into passing a series of Security Council resolutions authorizing the use of force to go into Afghanistan and stabilize the region, to begin nation building. And NATO bought into this. NATO said, "Well, we have that." So NATO implemented another paragraph of the NATO treaty, which is Article 4, and it's basically it's instead of collective self-defense, it means we can use military power to promote the security needs of a member state as needed. And so under Article 4, NATO started dispatching troops using this United Nations resolution as a cover to carry out anti-terrorism, counterterrorism, and nation-building exercises. These things called provincial reconstruction teams were dispatched and used to build up infrastructure, to create governance, to train troops, etc. And that's how NATO got involved. They got involved via the vehicle of international law. I mean, the one thing we can't say about the Afghan intervention early on is that it violated international law. Actually, it was one of the most legitimate, quote unquote, military interventions in modern history, because it had basically crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's when it came to international law. We had the United Nations, we had NATO, we had everything, brought in. Everybody supported it. The whole world supported going in there and basically rebuilding Afghanistan. What they didn't support is what the United States did after that. You see, after we brought everybody in and said, "Hey, we're going to let you build, reconstruct all this stuff, and we need you to work under a unified command structure," we're going to keep this other command structure in place, the counterterrorism command structure, and we're just going to go around and do whatever we want, including assassinating people, the hunt for bin Laden. We couldn't trust to an international organization. The CIA came in and recruited basically a private army The British intelligence services came in and recruited their own army. And we did this all as separate from the Afghan government that we were trying to build, meaning that all these private secret Afghan armies that we built weren't responsive to the Afghan government. They were responsive to the CIA or British MI6 or American Special Operations, but they weren't responsive to the Afghan government. And the operations they carried out undermined the legitimacy of the Afghan government and the legitimacy of the nation building work that NATO was undertaking. So the United States invited everybody in, told them to do X, and then we did Y and undermined everything they were trying to do. I mean, that just shows you the insanity of what was going on in Afghanistan.
Yeah, but what was it really about? I know the Taliban, for example, had stopped the growing of poppies. I mean, if it wasn't about hunting down bin Laden in a cave, there must have been something more to it. I mean, certainly looking at it, one of the aspects to it is the absolutely massive increase in opium production there.
Well, here's the deal. I mean, the United States, when the CIA first came in, prior to 9/11, we already had a relationship with certain tribal elements in Afghanistan as part of our war against the Taliban. We were supporting this entity called the Northern Alliance. We were providing them with millions of dollars, and all. And then when we intervened after 9/11 and the Taliban started to collapse, we immediately went in and started to recruit these militias that used to be allied with the Taliban, but now we bought them off. And the CIA never allowed many of these militias to be disbanded and to report to the Afghan government that we're rebuilding. Instead, we basically allowed these militias to govern over vast regions of Afghanistan and do what they wanted to do, which included growing opium or growing poppies and producing opium that was converted into heroin and stuff, and making millions of dollars doing that. This was the way that we paid off these tribal elements to remain loyal to the CIA. So that's what happened. The Taliban, when we invaded, the Taliban had pretty much eradicated poppy harvesting in Afghanistan. Then we empowered these tribal elements, and that's all they did. And then what we did is, in order to win the loyalty or keep the loyalty of certain tribal elements, they said, well, wait a minute, this tribe over there is growing poppies right now, and they're competing with us. We need that to end. So we'd come in with a poppy eradication program, but we weren't eradicating poppies. We were eradicating the competition of the poppy growers that we were supporting. That's just the crazy way that we were. Some people say that we were manipulating Afghan tribal politics, but I would say that we're being manipulated by Afghan tribal politics, meaning that we weren't necessarily the ones calling the shots here. We were getting used by these extremely corrupt tribal leaders who made millions off of money they received directly from the CIA, but they made even more money off of growing poppies that was converted into opium.
Now, Afghanistan couldn't really be much further away from the United States of America, Scott. It's a bit difficult to justify the idea that this rather backward country is really that much of a threat to the superpower that is based in, has got Washington as its capital. So I mean, obviously it's in an interesting place on the world island geopolitically. You've got Iran next door, you've got Russia next door, you've got Pakistan. I mean, surely this is, there's some geopolitics involved here rather than just the idea that you've got these, particularly, there must be wonder terrorists in Afghanistan that are threatening the United States.
No, you're correct. First of all, understand that Afghanistan, we call it a nation, but it's not a nation in the traditional sense. A nation is a specific geographical entity where the population is united in a vision that reflects the will of the totality of the people involved. Afghanistan is the exact opposite. It's a conglomerate tribes that don't necessarily get along with one another, all of whom occupy this ungovernable space. It's a nation only because its borders are defined by the ability of these ungovernable people to push back against their neighbors and prevent them from occupying them, as opposed to them trying to push out their borders and define it. So it's basically this ungovernable space. But it is located in a very critical part of the world. It's a bridge between, for instance, Iran, Pakistan, and China, Iran, Pakistan, and India, through the former Soviet republics. You get into Russia. You also have the Silk Road that leads across into Europe. So it's positioned, and what we know is that this positioning is of strategic importance. We know this. Why? Because first Jimmy Carter and then Ronald Reagan met with the Taliban or met with Afghans to negotiate a pipeline that would transit Afghanistan to bring oil from the Central Asian republics into India. We were in negotiation with them prior to 9/11. During the 1980s, we were discussing this with them all the way through into the 1990s. So the notion that we didn't know anything about Afghanistan prior to this is absurd. We also knew that Afghanistan was sitting on one of the world's largest reserves of exotic metals. And that during the time they've only recently gained importance because they're critical to electronics. But that's there. So there is a material wealth and element to that, but also there's an element that if you can stabilize Afghanistan and use Afghanistan as part and parcel, sort of a glue to link these Eurasian nations together, Iran, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Russia, China, Pakistan, India, and link them all together, you've created a center of gravity that directly competes with the transatlantic alliance between the United States and Europe. So it's in America's interests to continue to destabilize Afghanistan, because as long as Afghanistan's destabilized, you can't have this Eurasian linkage. And so, yes, there's a huge geopolitical element to Afghanistan that goes beyond simply bin Laden was there and launched a terror attack. We would have had a hard time explaining to the American people why we were in Afghanistan without the 9/11 attacks. But once the 9/11 attacks occurred and we got into Afghanistan, we allowed ourselves to be sucked into this geopolitical vortex without really understanding how we wanted to emerge. I think that's one of the problems is we never really had a good end game on how this was going to end.
Well, that's a very interesting analysis, and as I would have expected from him, you can see what he's doing with the questions about 9/11, because being an ex-US military officer and so on, and of course he's aware of how the US politics works. He can't keep a platform to talk about things if he starts talking at that level. So we've got to put that aside. I'm pretty confident that he does understand about that stuff, but he doesn't want to talk about it. You're pressing him on it, but he's quite professionally saying, I'm not going down that road, because he's trying to show the American people that, you've made a mistake here, rather than, this is actually an evil plot, as it were.
But I think some of the most interesting stuff he was saying, loads of interesting, I think, for me, I learned a lot listening to Scott. He seems to have a very deep insight into the customs of the area. But it's this whole idea that the idea of being there is it's this divide and ruin, Dan Glazebrook book idea, that it could become, as he said there, a centre of gravity geopolitically for an opposition to the transatlantic alliance.
Okay, let's deal with that. Don't forget that the intervention in Afghanistan didn't begin in 2001. It began in the late 1970s. And Brzezinski openly said that we didn't support the Mujahideen after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. What happened was there was a coup against the monarchy in Afghanistan, and the military officers that carried out the coup, similar to kind of coups that had taken place in Libya and Egypt and other places, they wanted to modernise the country. and they had a secular philosophy, and they were influenced by Marxist ideas. And obviously, they wanted to try and do things like educate women, carry out a land reform, and modernise the country, bringing in electricity into the villages, all of that sort of stuff. And from the get-go, the Western powers working through the Pakistanis stirred up the rural population, particularly in southern Afghanistan, to resist the central government in Kabul. And not only to resist passively, but basically to, kill people, shoot police officers. Women teachers, for example, were a major target of the Mujahideen, because we don't believe in women education, so any women teachers, we're going to kill them. And we paid for that, folks. We in this country, in Britain, we paid for Operation Cyclone. MI6 were deeply involved. They were the lead agency because the British are regarded within the Western Alliance as being the experts on Islamic countries.
So I would imagine glorious Rory Stewart, the Tory MP, who was chairing the Defence Select Committee when I did an article about him, the Bilderberger, chairing the deciding where all the money is spent in the British military. So he was over there. He was definitely exposed. I mean, we did it on this show probably 2 or 3 years ago now, actually. No, when the leadership elections, 2019, mid-2019, that he was working for MI6. But look, what about Brzezinski? We heard a little bit from him, but I mean the grand chessboard, the book, and also, of course, Brzezinski was involved, wasn't he? And negotiating on the Pakistan-Afghan border. Just to make sure that the US knew where the future was going to go, which was US-controlled extremist Islamist elements in there, in order to deny that place to the Russians.
Yes, exactly. So I don't suppose Scott would...
Hang on, sorry, Martin, to interrupt you again, but he also wrote, didn't he, about what we need is a new Pearl Harbor.
That wasn't him.
Wasn't it?
No, the new Pearl Harbor is from the... what's it called? The... PNAC, the Project for a New American Century. So Brzezinski's not directly linked to that, although he's very, he's got similar attitudes. Brzezinski, of course, was a Democrat, whereas the PNAC people were all Republicans. But they're all part of the US foreign policy establishment, which is quite a narrow clique, really. So he persuaded Carter that what we're going to do is we're going to support the Mujahideen against the government of Afghanistan. They weren't an elected government. The elections in Afghanistan, there's been attempted elections since we invaded, but before that, there's never been any elections. So the way Afghanistan works as a very decentralised, not very technological place, is local leaders run local areas and then they do deals with other local leaders. That's how things work, and has done for centuries. So this modernising government in Afghanistan wanted to improve things, and they represented kind of middle-class aspirations in the towns. But of course the vast majority of the population live in rural areas, very conservative lifestyle, very conservative politics and social attitudes. And they were able to be stirred up quite easily by the ISI and with Saudi money, and they began attacking the Afghan government's officials and so on. So the Afghan government then turned to the Russians and said, we're trying to modernise the country, but we got all these pesky rebels in the rural areas who are sort of shooting our police officers and women teachers and so on. Will you help us? And the Russians, rather reluctantly, I think there was actually a coup within the coup, where a more extreme faction of the coup plotters had taken over, and they thought that they were going to create more problems. So the Russians actually invaded reluctantly to push out this more extreme faction in the hope that they could just stabilise the situation. Because don't forget, Afghanistan is right next to them, as it was. It would be as if there was a coup in Mexico. Yeah, or for us, a coup in Ireland or whatever. It's right next door, so they can't just ignore it. And then, of course, what happened in the White House, and we've got all this, it's all on the record, they cheered when the Soviets invaded, because the purpose of supporting these Mujahideen rebels against the government was exactly to provoke a Russian invasion, Soviet invasion. And Brzezinski said, what we're going to do now is we're going to give them back. We're going to punish them for what they did to us in Vietnam. This is going to be their version. And sure enough, it was. It took 10 years. But the Soviet army was beaten, had to withdraw, and it ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was regarded as a massive success inside the Beltway in Washington, and no doubt within MI6, etc. But of course, that then created a civil war between the Mujahideen factions. So they don't care about that, frankly. I mean, it didn't mean much to them. But from the point of view of the Pakistani ISI, having the civil war going on in Afghanistan was, again, they're now basically running the show, and they built up the Taliban as a means of, because the Taliban, of course, because they've got an Islamist ideology, are somewhat above the tribal politics of Afghanistan. The same thing was true of the Islamic Courts Union in Somalia, because they've got very big clan politics there. But if you've got young people who've got a wider ideology, you can do something, to squat.
Anyway, the reason we're
that.
Going into a lot of this in some real depth here is because of this whole kind of grand chessboard concept.
Yeah,
very important.
Well, that was his book. It's called The Grand Chessboard.
That's right, Brzezinski's book, and it's because really what he was doing there was plotting out the next 50, 60 years of world history.
Yes, and Brzezinski was very influenced by Mackinder, who's the British geographer who talked about the heartland theory and who controls the heartland controls. And basically what we're talking about is, if you think about history, Asian empires have been superseded by maritime empires based initially in Spain and Portugal, then in Holland, then in Britain, and then following on to the United States. Yeah? So you've got this, what you might call, they're called thalassocratic regimes based on naval power. Yeah? Whereas traditionally empires in Asia are land empires, created by land.
They don't need to really bother about anything on the sea because there's so little of it. Actually, almost all of it, of course, is not sea. Most of the countries are not necessarily.
That's right.
Haven't got a sea border.
That's right. But at the same time, I mean, of course, there's a lot of historical discussion about this, because the Chinese Ming Emperor sent a massive fleet to sail into the Indian Ocean and long before the Portuguese and the Spanish came in there. But the China is so big and self-contained that they just when he fell from power, the new regime decided it wasn't interested in doing anything with the sea at all. So they just wrecked all the ships, and because they've got enough to manage with. It's a big country. There's lots of things there that they do, and we don't. And when the British arrived in the 18th century, and they said we've got all this stuff, and the Kangxi Emperor
would you like to trade with us?
And they said, well, we're not interested in your stuff.
We don't need any of it. Thank you. Goodbye.
Yeah.
Anyway,
that wasn't actually true. Apparently, he was actually interested. He was pretending that he wasn't. But nevertheless, I mean, we're getting into
inscrutable.
Yes, we're now getting into a wider.
Yeah, well,
discussion.
Let's get back to the present, because the question I asked Scott Ritter there, which he didn't answer, I pressed him on. Why now?
I believe in Occam's razor, meaning the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. Let's put it this way: during the administration of George W. Bush, during the administration of Barack Obama, that's 16 years, we weren't getting out of Afghanistan. Everybody struggled to define what the mission was. There were various surges, various redefining of what we were doing there. Troop levels went up, troop levels went down. Even after we killed bin Laden in 2011, we still weren't talking about getting out of there. We were heavily invested in the region because I do think that some people started to understand the geopolitical significance of being in Afghanistan. And had a traditional American politician, for instance, had Hillary Clinton won the election in 2016, we'd still be in Afghanistan today, because she's a traditional, American imperial hegemony promoting type politician. But this guy named Donald Trump won, who doesn't operate from any book that's recognized by the American establishment. And early on, he went to the generals, and he almost got sucked into the trap. The generals and the warmongers all sat down and told him how important Afghanistan was, and if they just gave him more troops and just gave him more money, they could win this thing, and it would be great. And he said, okay, here's your troops, here's your money. I'm going to loosen up rules of engagement. You can kill anybody you want to kill. Just get the job done. And then he went to him a year later and said, how's it going? They said, well, we need more troops and more money. And He was the most honest American politician we had in a long time. He looked at the generals. He looked at Mattis, Mad Dog Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, former Marine, with extensive history in Afghanistan, and he called them losers. He says, you guys can't win a war. You don't know how to win a war. You're a bunch of losers. I gave you everything you asked for, and all I get is the same. We're out of here. And he made the decision that we're getting unplugged because he didn't buy into all the other stuff that all the other politicians had said why we need to be there. All he said is this is an unpopular war. We have troops over there that don't need to be there, and I'm bringing them home. And he began a process of negotiating with the Taliban, which again broke many, many rules, and actually negotiated a peace agreement and came up with a date of withdrawal, which was May of 2021. And the whole establishment went crazy. They just didn't buy into it. We know this because he gave a direct order to the military to pull the troops down to a certain level. And we found out after he lost the election that the military just shelved that order. And instead of reducing troops, actually reinforced them. So there were more troops in Afghanistan than less troops when Donald Trump left office because the establishment didn't want to get out of Afghanistan. That's just a reality. Now, Joe Biden is Mr. Establishment, but he was confronted with a predicament because he had this peace treaty, this peace agreement. And the Taliban were actually living up to the part of the agreement that said, we won't kill Americans as long as you're getting out. And Biden was also somebody who didn't believe in this mission long term. When he was vice president, he continuously told Barack Obama that he was against surging people in. He was against, promoting continuous conflict. So he saw this as an opportunity to get out. The question is, how do we get out and when do we get out? And Biden made the decision that the best way to get out is just to get out. He tried to get agreement within his administration. They had serious meetings in March because the May deadline was coming up. And by April, he overrode everybody and said, no, we're getting out. Yes, I will tell the Taliban we need an extension of this, but we're getting out. Then he went to NATO and he told NATO, we're getting out. And he set the date. We will be out by September 11th, 2021. Now, the interesting thing about this is that was a decision he made. Now, the politician comes in. We now know that, A, he was negotiating extensively with the Taliban, that there was a deal cut between him and the Taliban on how this was going to unravel. 2, he knew that the Afghan government would collapse. He had a phone conversation with the Afghan president in March where the president said, hey, man, we're being invaded. This is all over. It's all she wrote unless you do something. And he said, what I need you to do is go out there and be positive about this, create a perception of success, even if it's not true. So Biden was telling the Afghan president to lie about the situation so that he could shape perception in the United States so that we could go forward with this withdrawal. Of course, it all came to a head when the Afghan government did, in fact, collapse. The Taliban took over the country, and now we're stuck basically, holding the bag. And we had to go in and negotiate in the theater of the absurd, where we would deploy 6,000 troops into the most indefensible space in all of Afghanistan, and who were totally dependent upon the mercy of the Taliban not to slaughter them, and then undertake this humanitarian fiasco, which we called an evacuation, that resulted in an act of terror that killed 13 Americans, over 170 Afghans. And now we have this debacle where America's out of Afghanistan, and it looks as though the Taliban won. They did win, but that's how it happened. It was basically just poorly executed policy. I don't see. And England learned the hard way that when you're the poodle of the United States, unfortunately, when we say heal, you have to heal. England didn't have a choice. They have no power projection capability. They've got nothing. They can protest all they want, but at the end of the day, England had to do what the United States told them to do in Afghanistan, which is get in here, get your people out, and get out of here with us. So did the rest of Europe. Nobody had the ability to say no to the United States because the United States is the master, and they're just a bunch of puppies that follow the direction that their master tells them to go.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we had our Puma helicopters in there, and the British Royal Air Force didn't actually have the transport capability, big enough aircraft to bring those helicopters out. So we had to actually hire a massive aircraft from the Russians to get our aircraft out, which is ironic. But look, so looking at it now, I mean, what you're describing there is an absolutely colossal humiliation that really does spell doom, I suppose, for any credibility for the NATO forces, and particularly for the United States as a world power.
Yes, if we lived in a world that was governed by rational thinkers, that's true. First of all, the United States is not going to learn any lesson from Afghanistan, just like we didn't learn any lesson from Vietnam. There will be a period of time where we lick our wounds, and where there's some bitterness and recrimination, etc. But we will always continue to operate in the way that we have to operate in order to sustain who we are and what we are as a nation. We are a nation that is totally dependent upon our ability to dictate outcomes to the rest of the world, on our ability to gain access to resources we need to survive as a nation and guarantee that we acquire these resources at prices that are affordable to us without overly enriching you. We are a global empire, and until the empire totally collapses, this is the way the United States will operate, and it compels us to behave in a certain manner. And we will do this, and the world will accept this until the world can come up with the appropriate means of pushing back, whether this is a revitalized Russia, whether this is a revitalized China, whether this is a Russian-Chinese alliance, whether this is a Eurasian entity that emerges from a post-Afghan environment, whether it's a combination of the three, until there's sufficient pushback to keep the United States from behaving in this fashion. This is what the United States is going to do. Yeah, it's humiliating. So is Vietnam. We recovered from that. We'll recover from this.
Scott, your books, your latest book, can you just let our listeners know what it is, where they can get it?
Well, the latest book is it's called Scorpion King. It's a history of America's addiction to nuclear weapons from FDR to Donald Trump. It's published by Clarity Press. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, any of the online booksellers.
Okay, Scott Ritter, thanks very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, Scott Ritter there, Martin, basically taking us through. Really, sounds to me, from what he's saying, is this was Donald Trump's work, which was really picked up and embraced by Joe Biden.
Yeah, well, he also pointed out that Biden was opposed to Petraeus's surge during the Obama administration. And Obama was basically, everybody who tries to get elected in the United States promises the punters that they're going to end the wars. Yeah, even Nixon promised that he was going to end the war in Vietnam, but with honour, as opposed to dishonour or whatever. So, because they went in on a kind of rage factor, which he discussed in the first interview. Once that rage factor's gone, they just want to go home. They don't care about Afghanistan, really. As he said, they just want a load of bodies to get the revenge for 9/11. So the politics in the US is pretty, it's pretty childlike, frankly. But I mean, so then if you want to get elected, Obama promised it, Trump promised it, Biden promised it. We're going to end the wars, all these foreign wars.
What about this whole business of the end of the US empire now, the humiliation?
Well, listen, the US empire may have been defeated in Afghanistan, but Afghanistan is, as you pointed out, a very poor, backward country, a long way away from where the major power centres in the world are. So that doesn't mean that the US is going to. What Biden's thinking and the war faction in the US are now thinking is, what we really need to do is reconfigure to take down the Russians and the Chinese. And if we're bogged down in Afghanistan, the Chinese and the Russians got an obvious way to hit back at us if they don't like what we're doing. So, for example, if there had been a war with the Russians, quite possible could have happened, then don't forget that the US military in Afghanistan are dependent upon trains carrying food from Europe to feed their troops in Afghanistan. They don't eat the local stuff. Yeah, so they're actually in a very exposed position there. If there is a major war with Iran and with Russia and China, any US and British military forces in Afghanistan are going to end up either dead or in a prison camp.
Yeah, mincemeat, basically. Obviously, next door to Iran, Afghanistan, you're quite right. If it kicks off, those British and American troops would have been horrendously exposed there.